The snow crunches beneath the boots of a Soviet patrol. 12 men move cautiously through the dense Finnish forest, their breath forming clouds in the -40-degree air. They scan the white landscape, searching for any sign of movement. There is none. The lead soldier pauses, raises his hand to halt the others. Silence. Then a crack echoes through the trees. The lead soldier collapses. Before the others can react, another shot rings out, then another. Within seconds, 5 men lie dead in the snow. The survivors dive for cover, scanning desperately for the source of the gunfire. They see nothing but endless white. For hours, they remain frozen in place, terrified to move. When reinforcements finally arrive, they find the survivors still huddled behind a fallen tree, traumatized. The sniper is gone, vanished like a ghost into the frozen wilderness. Back at Soviet headquarters, commanders receive yet another report of casualties from an invisible enemy. They call him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. And they have no idea that this phantom, this legend that haunts their nightmares, is a 5'3" farmer who never finished more than basic schooling. If you find this story incredible, wait until you hear what happens next. But before we continue, if you enjoy content like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. To understand how a simple farmer became history's most lethal sniper, we need to travel back to the frozen borderlands of Finland, to a small hamlet called Kiiskinen in the Rautjärvi region. Here, on the 17th of December, 1905, Simo Heiha entered the world as the 7th of 8 children. His parents were farmers, scratching out a living from the unforgiving soil of southeastern Finland, just kilometers from the Russian border. Life was hard. Winters were brutal. Survival required skill, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the land. From his earliest years, Simo learned the rhythms of nature. He learned to move silently through snow-covered forests, to read the patterns of animal tracks, to wait motionless for hours for the right moment to strike. He became a hunter, not by choice but by necessity. The Heiha farm was modest, and every child contributed. Simo worked alongside his older brother, tending to livestock and working the fields during the brief summer months. In winter, they hunted. Game supplemented their diet and provided furs for warmth. These early experiences shaped the young man profoundly. He developed an almost supernatural patience, an ability to remain still and focused that would later save his life countless times. But it was his skill with a rifle that truly set him apart. Shooting became more than a survival skill for Simo, it became a passion. Just 5 kilometers from the Heiha farm stood a shooting range operated by the Finnish Civil Guard, known as the Suojeluskunta. The Civil Guard was a voluntary militia separate from the regular Finnish army. Its members were civilians who trained in their spare time, preparing to defend their homeland against any threat. For young men in rural Finland, the Civil Guard represented community, purpose, and a connection to something larger than themselves. At the age of 17, Simo Heiha joined. From the beginning, he demonstrated remarkable talent. While other young men struggled to hit targets at 100 meters, Simo seemed incapable of missing. He practiced obsessively, spending every spare moment at the range. His discipline was legendary. Other members of the Civil Guard noticed that Simo never seemed frustrated by missed shots, never celebrated successful ones. He simply shot, noted the result, adjusted, and shot again. This methodical approach would later become his signature. At Civil Guard competitions, Simo began accumulating trophies, his small home filled with awards for marksmanship. Yet, despite his growing reputation, he remained humble, often standing at the back of group photographs, avoiding attention. During his Civil Guard training, Heiha once demonstrated a feat that stunned observers. Using a bolt-action rifle, where each round must be manually chambered, he hit a target 16 times in a single minute from 150 meters. This was extraordinary. The time required to work the bolt, reacquire the target, and fire accurately typically limited experienced shooters to perhaps 10 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Simo was already operating at a level beyond his peers. At the end of 1925, 20-year-old Simo Heiha began his mandatory 15-month military service with Finland's 2nd Bicycle Battalion stationed in Raivola. The bicycle battalions were light mobile units designed for rapid deployment across Finland's challenging terrain. Soldiers needed to be physically fit, adaptable, and skilled navigators. For Simo, already hardened by years of farm labor and hunting, military training posed no challenge. He excelled, his natural abilities enhanced by formal military instruction. After completing his service, Simo returned to his farm in Rautjärvi. He resumed his quiet life, hunting in the forests, working the land, and continuing to compete in shooting competitions. Years passed. He had no way of knowing that halfway across Europe, events were unfolding that would transform him from an unknown farmer into a legend. In the late 1930s, storm clouds gathered over Europe. Adolf Hitler's Germany was on the march, annexing Austria and threatening Czechoslovakia. But for Finland, the greater threat lay to the east. Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union watched its small neighbor with predatory interest. Finland had been part of the Russian Empire until 1917, when the chaos of the Russian Revolution allowed the Finns to declare independence. Moscow had never truly accepted this loss. In 1938, Soviet agents began approaching Finnish officials with demands. The conversations were framed as reasonable proposals for mutual security. Moscow wanted Finland to cede territory near Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city, located just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. Stalin argued that in the event of war with Germany, Finnish territory could be used to threaten Leningrad. He demanded land swaps, islands in the Gulf of Finland, and the lease of naval bases. The Finnish government listened, deliberated, and refused. They had seen what happened to nations that gave in to great power demands. Poland had been swallowed. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had accepted Soviet ultimatums in autumn of 1939 and found themselves occupied. Finland would not follow the same path. Negotiations continued through October 1939, but Stalin's patience was running out. When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov reported that the Finns would never accept the demands, Stalin made his decision. On the 26th of November, the Soviet government claimed that Finnish artillery had shelled the village of Mainila on the Soviet side of the border, causing casualties among Soviet soldiers. It was a lie. Historians would later confirm that the entire incident was staged by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. There were no Finnish artillery units in range of Manila. The supposed shelling was a fabrication, a false flag operation designed to provide a pretext for invasion. On the 29th of November 1939, the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations with Finland. The following day, Soviet forces crossed the border. The invasion began with overwhelming force. 21 Soviet divisions, comprising approximately 450,000 men, poured across the Finnish border. Soviet bombers struck Helsinki, the Finnish capital, on the very first day, their explosives taking approximately 100 civilian lives and destroying more than 50 buildings. When international condemnation followed, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov offered an absurd explanation. The planes, he claimed, were not dropping bombs but humanitarian aid to the starving Finnish population. The Finns, with their dark sense of humor, began calling Soviet bombs Molotov breadbaskets. In revenge for this mockery, they would soon name their improvised incendiary weapons Molotov cocktails. Stalin expected a quick victory. His commanders assured him that Finland would fall within weeks, perhaps days. The Red Army vastly outnumbered the Finnish forces. Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft gave them enormous advantages in firepower. Yet Stalin and his generals had made a critical miscalculation. They had underestimated the Finns. Finland's regular army was small, but its civil guard represented a vast reserve of trained, motivated fighters. These were men who knew the terrain intimately, men who had grown up skiing through frozen forests, hunting in impossible conditions. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence as a nation, and they were led by officers who understood that conventional tactics would mean suicide against Soviet numbers. Instead, they would use the land itself as a weapon. The winter of 1939-40 was brutal, even by Finnish standards. Temperatures plunged to minus 43 degrees Celsius. Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripts from warmer regions of the Soviet Union, were unprepared for such conditions. Their equipment froze. Their vehicles became immobile. Their supply lines, stretched thin across hostile territory, became targets for Finnish ski troops who appeared out of the white wilderness, struck with devastating effect, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Among these Finnish defenders was Simo Haiha. When the mobilization order came, the 33-year-old farmer reported for duty with the 6th Company of the 34th Infantry Regiment. He was assigned to the Kola sector, a critical position in Ladoga, Karelia, where Finnish forces faced the Soviet 8th Army. The terrain was perfect for defensive operations: dense forests, frozen lakes, and limited roads that channeled Soviet advances into predictable paths. But the Finns were vastly outnumbered. Everything depended on making every shot count. Simo arrived at the front with his own rifle, an M2830 that he had owned and used for years. This weapon deserves explanation. The M2830 was a Finnish variant of the Russian Mosin Nagant, the same basic design used by Soviet troops. But the Finnish version was different in crucial ways. Finnish gunsmiths had improved the accuracy, the trigger mechanism, and the sights. The Civil Guard's weapons manufacturing operations at Sako and Tika produced barrels of exceptional quality. The M2830 was also chambered for Finnish 7.62 by 53 mm ammunition, slightly different from the Russian round. This made it incompatible with captured Soviet ammunition, but the increased precision was worth the logistical complication. Most importantly, Simo's rifle had no telescopic sight. He used only iron sights, the same basic aiming mechanism found on rifles for centuries. This choice puzzled many then, and puzzles many now. Surely a sniper should use a scope for maximum accuracy. But Simo had practical reasons for his preference. Telescopic sights of the 1930s were prone to fogging and freezing in extreme cold. In temperatures of minus 40 degrees, a frozen scope could fail at the worst possible moment. Iron sights, by contrast, were utterly reliable regardless of conditions. There was another consideration. A telescopic sight could catch sunlight and flash, betraying a sniper's position. One momentary glint of glass could mean death. Iron sights produced no such reflection. Finally, using a scope required lifting one's head higher to align the eye with the optic. Iron sights allowed Simo to maintain a lower profile, keeping his body pressed closer to the frozen ground. In the deadly game of sniper versus sniper, every centimeter of exposure mattered. On the Kola front, Simo developed his methods with deadly precision. He would leave his position before dawn, skiing deep into the frozen forest toward the Soviet lines. He moved in complete silence, a white ghost against a white landscape. His uniform was all white, from his hat to his boots. Against the snow, he became virtually invisible. Finding a suitable position, Simo would prepare with meticulous care. He packed the snow around him tightly, preventing it from puffing upward when his rifle fired. A cloud of disturbed snow could reveal his location as surely as a signal flare. He kept snow in his mouth while aiming, preventing his breath from forming visible vapor in the frigid air. Then He waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days. Patience was not merely a virtue for Simo Häyhä, it was a weapon. When targets presented themselves, Simo fired with devastating accuracy. His rifle was zeroed for 150 meters, the most common combat distance in the forested terrain. He knew precisely how to adjust for variations in range. One shot, one life ended. Then he would relocate, never firing more than a few rounds from the same position before moving to prevent the Soviets from pinpointing his location and responding with artillery or mortar fire. The results were immediate and terrifying for the Soviets. Within the first weeks of the war, Simo's kill count began climbing at an astonishing rate. By the 22nd of December, just 22 days into the conflict, he had 138 confirmed sniper eliminations. The number seems almost impossible. More than 6 men per day, every day, in conditions so harsh that simply surviving was an achievement. But multiple sources documented Simo's record, and his commanders soon realized they had something extraordinary on their hands. The Soviets noticed too. Reports filtered back to Red Army headquarters of units being decimated by an invisible marksman. Soldiers who had survived encounters spoke of comrades falling one after another without any visible sign of the enemy. Terror spread through the Soviet ranks. Men became afraid to advance, afraid to expose themselves, afraid of the forests that seemed to harbor death itself. On the 21st of December 1939, Simo achieved what would stand as his single-day record. 25 confirmed eliminations, 25 men, each one targeted, each one struck down in the span of a single day of combat. To put this in perspective, a study of infantry combat found that an average of 7,000 rifle-caliber rounds were required to achieve one combat elimination during the First World War. During the Vietnam War, this number increased to more than 25,000 rounds per elimination. Simo was operating at a level of efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Word of the White Death spread through both armies. Finnish troops whispered his name with something approaching reverence. He was proof that one determined man could matter, that individual skill and courage could turn the tide against impossible odds. For Soviet troops, the White Death became a boogeyman, a figure of terror. Merely entering the Kola sector meant risking death from an enemy you would never see. By late December, Soviet commanders had decided that the White Death must be eliminated at all costs. They began dispatching counter-sniper teams, their best marksmen sent specifically to hunt down the Phantom who was decimating their forces. It was a reasonable strategy. Snipers are vulnerable to other snipers. A patient, skilled marksman with good intelligence might be able to locate and neutralize even the most elusive target. But something unexpected happened. The counter-sniper teams began dying. One after another, the Soviet Union's best shooters entered the frozen forests around Kola and did not return. Simo, it seemed, was as effective against trained snipers as he was against regular infantry. Perhaps more effective, since counter-snipers often exposed themselves in their eagerness to locate their target. The irony was bitter for Soviet commanders. Every time they sent their best men to eliminate the White Death, they only succeeded in reducing the overall quality of their sniper corps. The men sent against Simo were precisely the men they could least afford to lose. Simo was not operating alone, of course. He was part of a larger defensive effort, and his success depended on the courage and skill of his fellow soldiers. The Finnish forces at Kola faced overwhelming odds. 4 Finnish battalions defended the sector against the Soviet 56th and 164th Divisions, with additional Soviet units being fed into the battle as casualties mounted. The Soviets possessed massive artillery superiority. Some estimates suggest they fired nearly 40,000 rounds per day at Finnish positions, while Finnish artillery, limited by ammunition supplies, could manage only a fraction of that response. Yet the line held. The terrain worked in Finland's favor. The Soviets were prepared to advance along roads, but there were few roads in the Kola area, and all of them were guarded by Finnish troops. Soviet attempts to proceed cross-country failed because their troops lacked skis and the training to move effectively in deep snow. Finnish ski troops, by contrast, could appear anywhere, attack with devastating precision, and vanish before Soviet reinforcements arrived. This was the essence of Matti tactics, the Finnish strategy of isolating Soviet units and destroying them piecemeal. The term Matti referred to a unit of firewood, suggesting that Soviet forces could be chopped up into manageable pieces. Finnish troops would allow Soviet columns to advance, then strike at their flanks and rear, cutting supply lines and surrounding isolated units. Trapped without food, fuel, or ammunition, surrounded by enemies they could not see and forests they could not navigate, Soviet soldiers faced a grim choice between surrender and freezing to death. At Kola, the defense became legendary. When Major General Voldemar Hägglund, commander of the Finnish Fourth Corps, asked if Kola would hold, the response from Lieutenant Arne Juutalainen became a Finnish motto: "Kola will hold, unless we're told to run." The Finns did not run. Through 3 months of brutal fighting, through temperatures that froze exposed flesh in minutes, through artillery barrages that turned the forest into a hellscape of shattered trees and cratered earth, they held. Simo's kill count continued to climb. By the 26th of January 1940, he had reached 199 confirmed sniper eliminations. By the 17th of February, 219. His division commander, Colonel Antero Svensson, personally awarded him a custom honorary rifle in recognition of his extraordinary contribution to the defense. But Simo also used other weapons. In close quarters encounters and ambush situations, he wielded a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun, a Finnish-designed weapon known for its reliability in cold conditions. His kills with this weapon matched or exceeded his sniper tally, giving him a combined total that defied belief. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, this is the perfect moment to hit that like button and consider subscribing. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Life at the front was unimaginably harsh. Soldiers lived in snow trenches and hastily constructed bunkers, fighting both the enemy and the elements. Frostbite was a constant threat. Food was scarce. Sleep was interrupted by artillery barrages and the ever-present possibility of Soviet attack. Yet morale among the Finnish defenders remained remarkably high. They knew what they were fighting for. They knew that behind them were their families, their farms, their homeland. Surrender was not an option. Simo himself said little about his experiences during the war. He was not given to boasting or self-promotion. When asked about his methods, he offered simple explanations. "Practice," he said. He had practiced his whole life. Asked about his remarkable patience, he shrugged. Hunting in Finnish winters required patience. Everything else was just application of skills he had developed over decades. There was no secret technique, no special ability beyond relentless dedication to mastering his craft. Simo had spent years becoming intimate with his rifle, learning its characteristics until firing accurately was as natural as breathing. He knew the terrain because he had grown up in similar terrain. He could remain still for hours because he had spent his life waiting in silence for game. All of his preparation, all of his experience, had led to this moment. As the weeks passed, the Soviet military threw everything it had at breaking the Finnish lines. Fresh divisions arrived to replace the shattered remnants of earlier attacks. Artillery bombardments intensified. Soviet commanders, increasingly desperate to achieve the quick victory Stalin demanded, pushed their men forward in costly frontal assaults. The casualty figures were staggering. Soviet losses during the Winter War would eventually approach 300,000, including dead, wounded, and captured. Finnish losses, while significant for a small nation, were a fraction of that number. But the weight of Soviet numbers was telling. Despite heroic Finnish resistance, the defensive lines began to buckle. In late February, Soviet forces finally broke through the main fortifications of the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus. The Finnish government, recognizing that continued resistance could only lead to complete national destruction, began negotiating for peace. Simo Häyhä would not see the end of the war. On the 6th of March 1940, just 1 week before the armistice, his extraordinary run of luck finally ran out. He was operating in his usual manner, concealed in the snow, scanning for targets, when a Soviet soldier spotted him. The enemy rifle cracked, and an explosive bullet struck Simo in the lower left jaw. The damage was catastrophic. The bullet shattered both his upper and lower jaw, tore away most of his left cheek, and left him with wounds that would have been immediately fatal for most men. When Finnish soldiers found him, the trauma was so severe that he was presumed dead. His body was placed on a pile with other fallen soldiers, awaiting collection for burial. But Simo Häyhä was not dead. A soldier noticed a slight movement in the pile of bodies, a leg twitching. Simo was extracted, still alive but unconscious, and evacuated for medical treatment. He fell into a coma that would last for 11 days. When he finally regained consciousness, the war was over. The peace treaty between Finland and the Soviet Union had been signed on the 13th of March. The terms of the treaty were harsh. Finland was forced to cede approximately 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including parts of Karelia, where Simo had grown up. Hundreds of thousands of Finnish civilians became refugees, fleeing their ancestral homes rather than living under Soviet rule. But Finland had survived as an independent nation. Unlike the Baltic states, unlike Poland, Finland retained its sovereignty. The world watched in amazement at the tiny nation that had defied a superpower and, against all odds, preserved its freedom. The final tally of Simo Häyhä's combat record remains somewhat disputed, with different sources citing different figures. The Finnish Army document recorded 259 confirmed sniper eliminations by the 7th of March, the day after he was wounded. Adding his submachine gun kills brought the total to approximately 518. Other sources cite figures ranging from 505 to 542. Whatever the precise number, Simo Häyhä had achieved the highest confirmed sniper count in any major war in history, a record that stands to this day. For Simo, the months following the war were a struggle for survival of a different kind. He underwent 26 surgeries as doctors worked to reconstruct his shattered face. Part of his hip bone was used to rebuild his jaw. The recovery took 14 months. His obituary had already been written and published when word arrived that the White Death was, in fact, still alive. With grim Finnish humor, Simo reportedly sent a message home. "Stop the funeral. The deceased is missing." Despite his desperate desire to continue serving in the Finnish military, Simo's combat days were over. The injuries were too severe. He was permanently disfigured, his face bearing visible evidence of the bullet that had nearly ended his life. Finland promoted him to second lieutenant in recognition of his extraordinary service, and Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim personally congratulated him. But for Simo, the transition to civilian life was not easy. He returned to his farm in Rautjärvi, to the land he had grown up on, to the forests he knew better than anyone. He never married. He lived alone, working his land, doing his forest work, maintaining the quiet, solitary lifestyle that had always suited him. The fame that came with his wartime exploits seemed to embarrass him more than anything. He had never sought recognition. He had simply done what needed to be done. Finland would face Soviet aggression again. The Continuation War, fought from 1941 to 1944 alongside Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union, saw Finland attempt to reclaim lost territory. Simo was not physically able to participate, though many of his former comrades fought again. Eventually, Finland negotiated a separate peace with the Soviets, managing once more to preserve its independence, while much of Eastern Europe fell under communist domination. For decades after the war, Simo Häyhä lived quietly, avoiding the spotlight. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When asked, he deflected attention, minimizing his achievements, emphasizing that he had simply done his duty like every other Finnish soldier. This humility was genuine. Simo viewed his service not as a personal achievement, but as a collective effort by an entire nation fighting for survival. It was not until 2001, when Simo was 95 years old, that he finally opened up about his experiences. In one of his rare interviews, he was asked if he felt remorse for having eliminated so many men. His response was characteristically simple and direct. "I did what I was told to do as well as I could. There would be no Finland unless everyone else had done the same." There was no bravado in this statement, no pride, no regret, just a simple statement of fact from a man who had seen the worst of human conflict and made peace with his role in it. For Simo, the Winter War was not about individual heroism. It was about survival. Every Finnish soldier, every nurse, every civilian who contributed to the war effort had played a part in preserving their nation's existence. His marksmanship was simply his contribution. Simo Häyhä died on the 1st of April, 2002, at the age of 96. He had outlived the Soviet Union itself, that vast empire having collapsed in 1991. There was a certain poetry in this. The nation that had tried to swallow Finland, that had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers against Finnish positions, that had ordered artillery bombardments and airstrikes against Finnish cities, was gone. Finland remained. Simo was buried in his hometown of Ruokolahti. He left behind no wife, no children, no direct descendants to carry his story. But his legacy endures. He is remembered as history's deadliest sniper, a title supported by documented evidence that no other marksman has approached. More importantly, he is remembered as a symbol of Finnish resistance, of the sisu, the Finnish concept of determined courage in the face of adversity, that allowed a small nation to defy a superpower. The rifle he used, the M28-30, became famous in its own right. Finnish Mosin Nagant variants are prized by collectors today, valued for their exceptional accuracy and craftsmanship. The techniques Simo developed, from snow packing around firing positions to keeping snow in the mouth to prevent breath vapor, entered the curriculum of sniper training programs worldwide. His legacy extended far beyond Finland's borders. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Simo Häyhä's story is its ordinariness. He was not a professional soldier, not a special forces operative, not the product of intensive military training. He was a farmer who learned to shoot by hunting, who joined a local militia because that's what young men in his community did, who went to war because his country was invaded. Every skill that made him deadly had been developed in the course of an ordinary Finnish rural life. The lesson of the White Death is that extraordinary circumstances can reveal extraordinary potential in ordinary people. Simo never sought fame or glory. He never expected to become a legend. He simply did what he knew how to do, in service of what he believed in, with absolute dedication and focus. When the crisis passed, he returned to his quiet life, asking nothing more than to be left in peace. The Soviets who nicknamed him Belaya Smrt, the White Death, understood something profound. To them, he was not a man but a force of nature, as implacable and deadly as the Finnish winter itself. They threw counter-snipers against him and lost their best men. They offered bounties for his elimination and found no takers willing to face him. They bombarded his sector with artillery, and he simply relocated and continued his work. Nothing they did could stop him. Only a bullet to the face in the final days of the war managed what Soviet strategy could not. And even then, even with his jaw shattered and his face destroyed, Simo Häyhä survived. He survived and lived to see his nation remain free, to see the Soviet Empire that had threatened Finland crumble into history, to see his story inspire generations of soldiers and civilians alike. In the end, the White Death proved more enduring than the empire that had tried to destroy him. The tale of Simo Häyhä is often reduced to statistics: 500-plus eliminations, fewer than 100 days of combat, 150-meter iron sights. But statistics cannot capture the human reality behind the numbers. Every shot Simo fired was a moment of focus, a decision, a life taken in defense of his homeland. Every day in the frozen trenches was a testament to endurance. Every hour of patient waiting was a victory of discipline over the body's screaming demand for movement, for warmth, for relief. Those who have never experienced combat cannot fully understand what it means to spend weeks in conditions that would break most people, constantly aware that death could come at any moment, from any direction. Simo's psychological resilience was perhaps even more remarkable than his marksmanship. Many soldiers who achieve far less in combat are permanently traumatized by their experiences. Simo returned home and resumed a productive life, apparently at peace with what he had done. This, too, was part of Finnish sisu. There was no time for dwelling on trauma when there was a farm to work, forests to tend, a life to rebuild. The war had been terrible, but it was over. What mattered now was moving forward. This pragmatic acceptance of harsh reality was characteristic of Finnish culture, and Simo embodied it completely. Today, the Kola front where Simo fought is no longer part of Finland. The territory was ceded to the Soviet Union and remains part of Russia. But the memory of what happened there endures. Museums preserve the artifacts of the Winter War. Historians continue to study the conflict that so dramatically illustrated the potential for determined defenders to resist overwhelming odds. And at the center of these studies, always, is the figure of the White Death. If you made it this far, you've witnessed one of history's most incredible true stories. A farmer who became a legend, a man who asked for nothing but was given everything by fate, a warrior who found peace. Consider sharing this story with others who appreciate history, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the past. The White Death's tale has ended, but history's lessons live on. The mail-order rifle that Soviet propagandists mocked, the humble Mosin Nagant variant that looked like nothing special, became in Simo's hands the most deadly weapon of the Winter War. The small farmer from the Finnish borderlands, overlooked and underestimated, became a nightmare that haunted Soviet commanders, and when the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, it was Simo Häyhä who remained standing, his nation free behind him, his legend just beginning. This was the story of the White Death, the deadliest sniper in history, the farmer who held the line against an empire. Remember his name. Remember what he fought for. And remember that when the darkness comes, sometimes all it takes is one person in the right place, with the right skills, and the absolute determination to do what must be done.